With me today is Dr. Claire Taylor, who's a lecturer in medieval history in the Department of History here in Nottingham. Claire is an expert on the study of heresy, and she's going to try and address the question, why is heresy important? And the way historians, and also the question, how historians use heresy. First of all, Claire, you're very welcome. So why study heresy?
It's such an interesting area because what we're seeing is a sort of subtext in medieval society. It's a dissident voice, a sort of marginal voice, with very few sources for it. And one of the interesting things is that these sources are often quite problematic for historians because they're sources that are written by the enemies of heresy usually, rather than by the heretics themselves. But nonetheless, it's fascinating to try and to discern this subtext in society, the ideas of people who didn't completely accept what they were taught in religious terms, but actually had a whole series of responses to the divine and the way that they wanted to understand it.
That actually is interesting because, of course, when you go to the early church, theologians will often give you a whole list of famous heresies, and they don't realize that actually all we know about these heresies is what the surviving orthodox texts tell us. So actually there's a sort of a process of back engineering. They must have said that because of what the orthodox, the successful party, wrote about them. And often it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. They must be dreadful because this is what they must have said. And so heresy becomes, I almost feel that as soon as you see the word heresy, you should put it in inverted commas, because it's always something that someone else has described. It's one of those irregular verbs. I am orthodox, you're slightly deviant, the guy over there is a heretic. Why is it of value to a historian to look at heresy?
I think if somebody needs to look at heresy or dissident ideas in every historical society, it needs to be somebody's specialism, because that's where you are getting these sort of marginalised voices, where people are, the ideas are still sort of bubbling up and we're aware of them. But what we're sensing is almost, particularly in medieval society, we're sensing the ultimate enemy of Christianity, and the figure of the heretic is behind every bit of theology, every kind of church pronouncement or council. Always in the back of people's minds there's this figure who doesn't believe the same kinds of things. And this is where we get, for example, I mean, it was interesting that you talked about the ancient world, because in the sort of later Roman world and in the early medieval world, so until around about 1000, really we don't get incidents of popular heresy. We haven't got accounts of people believing on a popular level very difficult, controversial ideas. And what we get is people, churchmen, referring back to the ancient world, and they're looking for models and sort of exemplar of how to understand heresy. And it's Augustine that they look to, because he was the expert on heresy. He wrote De Heresis, lists of all the different heretics that there were. And people look back and they medieval churchmen chose the worst of these, the Manichae, the Manichaean ideas, which are completely antithetical to Christian belief. And so they use that word, and lots of the heresies in the Middle Ages are called Manichaean by churchmen, because they're identifying the worst possible thing that could exist, which means that they have to take action against it.
That's actually a very interesting example, because if we were having this conversation 50 or 60 years ago, we would have assumed there was a thing called the medieval Manichae.
Yes, that's right.
And we would have said that somewhere in southern France there were people who were actually signed up Manichaees. And then the next thing we would have done is we would have tried to trace a genealogy that would link a 4th century group to a 12th century group, and we would have wondered, had they been hiding around, and it was crazy stuff. Whereas actually the more we look at, certainly I, coming from the history of theology end of things, the more I look at it, I think, what I'm seeing in southern France is people who are just annoyed with the church. They may be annoyed with the local cleric. They may be annoyed with local church practices. They may be actually very annoyed with what they see as the avarice and have very real criticisms of church structures. And what actually the reaction to that is not to see these as just people who are often very rightly critical of church structures, but suddenly they are reinvented as ideologues of this enemy. And that's a major shift in history between, say, the medieval Manichae, when that was a major textbook, and the way we read the Albigensian situation today.
What you've done there is you've put your finger on a very key movement within the heresiologists, people who study heresy. That is a very good critique of the sources. I would argue that there are problems with that, because we do find examples of people in southern France talking about God not having created the world, for example. So ideas that are very oppositional to the Nicene Creed and what Christians are supposed to believe. They don't believe that Christ was made human, that he was just in some way a spirit, he wasn't made incarnate. And these things do really undermine core Christian beliefs. And there are echoes of them in other religious movements in Eastern Europe, where we can point to a little bit more continuity between the ancient and the modern world. So whilst everything you say is true, that these ideas or dissident heretical ideas could have emerged anyway in the West because of the social conditions and because of political conditions and so on, the particular kinds of ideas which do manifest themselves are actually heretical, and there's a lot of evidence that the people who are espousing them and holding these ideas are aware that they come from Eastern Europe as well. They explicitly talk about these new ideas coming from Greece, for example, and with evidence of missionaries coming from dissident heretical churches in the East and coming to the West.
So if I'm reading something like Montaigne, I can read it as an account of the official view of what's happening. I can also see it as an account of the dissidence that is taking place in an economically challenged environment. But there is also, you would argue, an element in which they are truly a distinct religious group who are actually tapping into other non-standard religious ideas.
Yes, that's right. With Montaigne, that's a very late manifestation
I'm
of
taking
his.
it because it's such a.
It's so famous. That's right. That's right. When you look at Montaigne and you look at the ideas that are expressed there, you've got a fascinating mixture of ideas which do relate to the heresy that historians generally call Catharism. This idea that there were two gods and the material world was fully evil. At the same time, you get manifestations of kind of folkloric belief, if you like, which are threatening still to the church. And the inquisitors, Jacques Fournier, who investigated the people at Montaigne, definitely found these ideas very threatening and took the trouble to record them. But at the same time, it's a very diluted version of this heresy by that period, whereas in the middle of the 13th century, we're getting very explicit references that kind of tie us in a purer way, perhaps, to sort of dualist ideas. And essentially what we find is that what Montaigne is a kind of revival of these ideas after they'd disappeared really for a couple of decades, and that was the success of the Inquisition, that it had managed to suppress and destroy the basis of support for these ideas. So Montaigne is people coming back from Italy where they'd been and studied these ideas again, because these ideas were very rife in northern Italy, and then returning to southern France and disseminating these ideas again.
One last question is, it's clear that these are the lost voices. Why are historians interested in lost voices?
Well, these days it's almost as though we don't need to answer that question, because these lost voices have become so popular, firstly with the publication of Montagu and its great success, but also because these lost voices, the Cathars specifically, are now being very heavily reflected in popular culture. So in Dan Brown's books, the Cathars appear. Kate Moss's book Labyrinth is about this sect as a persecuted group. But I think that there's a reason why the public are very interested in these ideas, even though historians have been going on about them for a long, long time. And I think it's because it reflects a kind of subversion, a critique of modern society as well. So I think people are kind of talking about these dissident, marginalised voices in the Middle Ages as being something that exists throughout history, and these kind of voices existing in the modern period as well.
Claire, thank you for taking us from the early church through the Middle Ages right to today. Thank you.